Why did we love Deus Ex? The innovative game design? The complex and cinematic story? The plethora of options? Let's find out. Deus Ex was a game that refined the template of a game design philosophy that changed the way players viewed and interacted with the medium. The plethora of choices available to the player was staggering when compared with its contemporaries, allowing players, for the first time, to choose their path and their own adventure. The gripping cinematic story, while tame by modern standards, was rarely seen during the years leading up to its release. This is a story of intrigue, betrayal, and conspiracy, and it asks real questions about the nature of people and power. Deus Ex was a joy to play for so many simply because it could be enjoyed in so many different ways, and this feeling extends to many aspects in the game. It is a design that persists even today and has been refined and perfected as gaming technology has advanced. And while Deus Ex was not the beginning of the journey for this style of game, it is the first marked increase in its quality and the first time many people came into contact with it. Deus Ex was released in 2000, developed by Ion Storm and published by Eidos Interactive. The game's creation was headed by now legendary game designer Warren Spector. Deus Ex was generally well liked and received by critics, who praised the game's design aspects and its story, most giving the game 9s and 10s across the board. The game sold well, selling 138,000 units in the US, and almost double that in Europe. In its first decade, Deus Ex sold over 1 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling games of all time at that point. The first inception of Deus Ex happened in 1994 under the working title Troubleshooter, and was conceived as Spector's dream project, but development only truly began in 1997. We cannot talk about Deus Ex without first talking about the Immersive Sim. Immersive Sims are a category of game that focus on player choice and freedom of play. They are typically games that prioritize systems over scripts. In most blockbuster titles, events happen in scripted orders. Stories, actions, and events take place when they are supposed to and in the exact way they are supposed to. Immersive Sims, however, are player-driven. They are reactive. An immersive sim is built on a series of overlapping systems that react and respond to each other based on context. This is the design ethos of games like Dishonored, System Shock, Thief, and of course, Deus Ex. Immersive sims are loved by their players for their ability to allow the player to be creative in their approach. The design encourages creativity and experimentation. This can lead to a satisfying conclusion for the player, after they've beat a particularly challenging section, and knowing it was because they beat the system, and not because they were supposed to win. As a side note, it can also lead to some pretty funny system interactions, as the game's AI breaks trying to figure out what you're doing. When a player conceives of an idea about how to solve a certain puzzle or approach a certain encounter, it harms the player's enjoyment when they are told they simply aren't allowed to do it that way. It isn't fun to be told to play the way the creator intended and no other way. This is one of the main things that drives the love for immersive sims. The creation of the immersive sim is most commonly attributed to Warren Spector and his team at Looking Glass Studios. After the closure of Looking Glass Studios and the dissolution of the team, many went to work for other companies, but brought the Looking Glass design ethos with them. When Spector and his contemporaries created the earliest immersive sims, while they all had aesthetic and stylistic differences, they all maintained 3 key characteristics. 1. A focus on player agency. 2. A downtrodden and fractured world. And 3. A desire to speak truth to power. These 3 core ideals have persisted in the theming and creation of immersive sims, even until today.
Your appointment to FEMA should be finalized within the week. I've already discussed the matter with the senator.
I take it he was agreeable?
He didn't really have a choice.
Has he been infected?
Oh yes, most certainly. When I mentioned that we could put him on the priority list for the ambrosia vaccine, he was so willing it was almost pathetic.
This plague, the rioting is intensifying to the point where we may not be able to contain it.
Why contain it? Let it spill over into the schools and churches. Let the bodies pile up in the streets. In the end, they'll beg us to save them.
The game opens on a cutscene of two shady-looking characters discussing what appears to be a plan for world domination. But with no context of what they're talking about or who they are, the player is left to wonder. And this intrigue is what carries them through the necessary, if slightly clunky, tutorial. Now, I won't talk much about this tutorial because I honestly believe it's one of the game's biggest failings. The tutorial is mandatory, which makes sense for the time. The Immersive Sim was a fairly new concept, but now feels unnecessary and worse, unwanted. The player, controlling UNATCO member Agent Denton, must move through a series of linear rooms completing tutorial sections, with only one solution. The opposite of how the rest of the game is played. These rooms are meant to show off each of the game's major systems, hacking, sneaking, combat, environmental hazards, but doesn't begin to scratch the surface of the options available to the player. The tutorial ends in a large and frankly insultingly easy room that the player must cross using skills that they've learned to complete the tutorial.
Very good. I hope you remember this lesson, Agent. They have assigned us to be partners, and I will not stop to hold your hand and repeat myself when we are facing a real enemy.
Now for the last test. You have to find a way across the river to the exit on the other side. There's more than one way to get there, depending on your approach and the skills you want to use. It's up to you. Make use of the IFF system to identify enemies. The crosshairs will highlight red over enemies, green over allies, and white over neutrals.
But here's where it gets good. After a short briefing from your boss, Mandley, you're given your first mission. A group of terrorists have stolen a shipment of vaccines for a mysterious illness known as the Grey Death and have holed up in the Statue of Liberty. Your job is to go in, find the leader, and interrogate him into telling you where the vaccine is. But there's a catch. Another UNATCO agent, the gruff German cyborg Herman, yes, Herman the German, has been captured inside the statue, and you're tasked with freeing him. This mission can be accomplished in any way you see fit. Your brother Paul, also an agent with UNATCO, tries to get you to use stealth or non-lethal force, citing that at the end of the day, you are still police officers and should use deadly force only when necessary. But when the time comes, the choice is yours. And this is where you see what Deus Ex really has to offer. There are several ways to get into the statue and to complete your mission. I tried a stealthy, non-lethal approach until things went a bit hairy and then, well, just watch. This first mission is indicative of how the rest of the game will play out. You're presented with a problem and told to solve it. You aren't told how to solve it, but you're given a few options. These options, however, are rarely your only courses of action. Once Herman is rescued, you proceed to the top of the statue and confront the leader of the terrorists. This begins a verbal confrontation where he explains to you that they weren't stealing the vaccine, but were liberating it and giving it back to the people. He begins to explain his ideology, that the rich and powerful are neglecting and harming the people, and that the terrorist organisation, the NSF, are the ones standing up for them. You are told by the NSF leader that the vaccine is already on its way back to the people, and nothing you do can stop it now. While you do apprehend the terrorist leader, his speech gets the player, if not Agent Denton himself, to think about which side they are actually on, and if the NSF's goals are really as nefarious as we've been told. The year is 2052. Megacorporations own unmatched monopolies on all aspects of everyday life. There is a massive wealth inequality, with many people living in abject poverty or being outright homeless, living in parks, abandoned subway tunnels, and even sewers. Few can afford basic medical treatment, and the life-saving drug ambrosia, cure to the Grey Death, is withheld from the general population and hoarded by the world's elite ruling class. Life is hard, miserable, and short for many people, and those with the power to do something to help don't seem to care. The game takes place within enclosed zones or cells. These cells are usually linked together through short loading screens, allowing the player, at certain points of the story, to move between them. This gives the feeling that the world is much larger than it actually is. This was a smart way to work around the limited technology of the time that would not allow for detailed 3D open worlds to be rendered. At several moments during the game, you will return to previously explored locations, and they have changed since your last visit. New characters, new challenges, and new ways to interact with the environment. This gives the feeling that the world exists outside of your direct involvement with it, that you're a part of the world and not apart from it. Deus Ex's modular gameplay and player agency are the game's greatest selling points. The player has a multitude of options when presented with a challenge, whether they want to be sneaky, creeping through shadows and around obstacles, or breaching security systems and turning them on their foes, or run in and gun down any adversary they encounter, or a mixture of any of these playstyles. Deus Ex's levels are designed in a way to allow the player to accomplish their task their way. The game's stealth systems are surprisingly robust, taking into account lighting, line of sight, and noise. There were a few moments where I was sure I should have been seen, but realised I was blended into the darkness. Conversely, there were times I was sure I was hidden, but hadn't taken into account all the variables, like gaps in crates or other roaming guards. However, due to the dated nature of the game's AI and code, there were also times I failed because the game had deemed I had broken a parameter despite the fact that I barely moved. One egregious example of this was when sneaking through an enemy barracks, and while crouching I stepped onto and off a very low and terribly placed footlocker, and the guard outside the door heard it, despite the game giving me no sound cue that I had done anything of the sort. Deus Ex also, naturally, features hacking. This means that the player can gain information, such as passwords or door codes, from computers, or to breach and turn off enemy surveillance systems, or outright hijack them and make them work for you. This system, while at times limited, can offer a plethora of options when maneuvering through enemy territory, such as turning off cameras, making weapon systems target your enemies instead of you, or making guard robots switch sides. Combat is where Deus Ex really stumbles. While there are many different weapons for the player to choose from, the game's shooting mechanics, while no doubt meant to promote a slow and methodical approach, are simply downright clunky. The basic idea is that the player's firing reticle expands to a maximum width while the player is moving or changes weapon, and slowly constricts while the player is standing still and aiming at something. When fired, the weapon will hit randomly anywhere inside the reticle. This system is also used in many modern games, a system many of us are familiar with. The reticle, however, is huge for every gun, and it sometimes takes up to 15 or 20 seconds for the reticle to fully constrict. This makes mid-range combat very difficult. Trying to fight through cover and having to wait for the reticle to constrict again before you can fire without wasting the majority of your ammo because the gun's RNG decided to hit a wall instead of the enemy. Another aspect of the gunplay which makes it clunky and unwieldy to use is the fact that even with a simple 10mm pistol, guns can take a full 5 to 10 seconds to reload, and as changing weapons also expands the targeting reticle, once a gun's magazine is dry, you have few good options but to run away. This is obviously a way to try to encourage the player to take a more methodical approach to problem solving other than just shooting everything. This, however, is compounded by the issue that the game actually rewards the player for aggression. The best source of resources during a mission is the bodies of enemies, and although you can loot enemies whether they're dead or unconscious, most enemies carry ammo for guns instead of the silent trank darts or the riot prod charges, your two main forms of non-lethal takedowns. This is compounded again by the fact that the loud, lethal guns are far more powerful and varied than the silent, non-lethal ones. And even silent guns are weaker than their louder counterparts. The silenced pistol deals half the damage of the unsilenced one, making it harder to use this gameplay style. The trank darts also immediately alert the enemies to your presence, and take about 10 seconds to drop an enemy, making them next to useless in a stealth run. This isn't to say the combat is completely terrible. I have definitely seen worse, and after a few hours of gameplay, you do begin to get used to it and be able to use it somewhat effectively. But it definitely feels dated, and would be a fairly daunting barrier to entry for someone playing the game for the first time. Deus Ex is a very save load kind of game, especially if you care about completing missions in a certain way. Alarms will trip and you'll be hitting escape and load by reflex after just a couple of hours of play. Initially, I tried to play the game pacifistic and stealthy, but after the first mission gave up in favour of a mixed approach of all the game's systems, stealth, hacking and shooting. Although I will admit, some parts of the game began to infuriate me to the point where I'd just pull out my machine gun and start gunning down enemies. Overall, Deus Ex's gameplay is enjoyable and tactical, allowing the player to think through problems and come up with creative solutions. But it also allows the trigger-happy moron in all of us to come out if we want it to. Despite clunky combat, the player does eventually get used to it and learn to predict the bullet spread of different weapons. So, why did we love Deus Ex? I believe it's because Deus Ex represented something in its time. It represented a drive for more immersive and engaging experiences. It represented a desire by gamers to take the road less travelled. And it represented an outcry and a rallying call for people who felt dejected. Deus Ex is loved by many because, in my opinion, it represents a shift in the attitudes of many around the turn of the millennium, an attitude that persists for many to this day, a desire for change and a desire for growth. Deus Ex took disparate aspects of earlier works and combined them seamlessly to create an experience unlike anything else at the time. It was, and still is, revolutionary. Thanks for watching.